Okay, Roman. So as we had planned to do, I'm going to give this give you a rendition of a talk that I gave not too long ago, and maybe we can start off with four scenarios that I think would be sort of familiar to the audience. James, a 72-year-old man, and on the one hand, maybe he's short of breath. He has fever, low oxygen, and he has ground glass opacities on his CAT scan, and then his PCR test is positive for SARS-CoV-2. And then the question may come up, does he have COVID-19? Another scenario would be the same man, same James, 72-year-old man, who had a stroke, is admitted to the hospital. He doesn't have any fever. His lungs are clear. But again, he tests positive for SARS-CoV-2 on his nasal screen. And the question is, does he have COVID-19? A third scenario would be the same James, has no complaints. He lives in a nursing home. There's been no change in his exam. And again, he tests positive for SARS-CoV-2 with PCR. And the question is, does he have COVID-19? And then the fourth scenario would be James has died. He was on hospice care. He had terminal cancer. And he is positive for SARS-CoV-2 either at autopsy or, shortly before he died. Did he die of COVID-19? And so, cases like that, scenarios like that have been, in the news, have been discussed and so forth. And I want to get a little bit into why these things are so perplexing by addressing the question of what is the diagnosis. When we say that somebody has COVID-19, what do we mean? What do we mean that if we label James as having COVID-19, what is it exactly that we mean? And I think my point is that the reason it's so perplexing is because currently when we practice medicine, modern medicine, we blend in two separate philosophical traditions when we make diagnoses. And we do this without much clarity. I mean, I think we do it completely without any philosophical clarity, so to speak. But there are two traditions that inform our medical practice. And they're very deep, and they're very deep-rooted into what we do. But I think it's very important to disentangle them. And one tradition, I'm going to label it the Hippocratic tradition or Hippocratic medicine or classical medicine, or I don't know if you want to call it bedside medicine. I think Hippocratic medicine would be the best term for it. And the other strand is scientific medicine. And so I'm going to explore with you these two strands, how these two strands inform the diagnostic process. But I'm going to focus first on the one that seems to be most familiar with us, which is the scientific medicine tradition. And at least the step that I'm going to describe are going to be most familiar because they've caught the attention of medical theorists, if you will, in the modern era, more so than Hippocratic medicine. In fact, Hippocratic medicine we tend to generally dismiss, and we'll get into this later. But so I'm going to focus now on scientific medicine and what does a diagnosis mean in the framework of scientific medicine. Okay. So I put here on the screen for you, I put a picture of René Descartes to illustrate scientific medicine. And I don't think that would be the image or the prototype person that one would necessarily associate with scientific medicine. If we think about scientific medicine, we tend to think about 19th century, maybe the French school, or the German school in the 19th century, following the development of the germ theory of disease and so forth. I mean, that for most people, and I think most medical historians, when we use the term scientific medicine, we just go back to the 19th century. But I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think we should go back 200 years previously to the beginning of science, of modern science, to speak to the beginning of the scientific revolution. Because the ideas that have informed scientific medicine in the 19th century really go back to the beginning of the scientific revolution. and we really need to think about scientific medicine as emerging back then. And so I use Descartes for several reasons. I mean, he's not the only, he's a major figure in the beginning of the scientific revolution. He's not the only figure, but number one, he's a major figure um, philosophically, and I think that will be important, as we will see. Number two, he was actually very interested in medicine himself. He was apparently a kind of a sickly guy, and he was very he was hoping that his new revolutionary philosophical ideas would bear fruit in medicine. And so I have Descartes and Cartesian thinking as the cornerstone, if you will, or the foundation for scientific medicine. I want to spend a few minutes here talking about what the scientific revolution was about at the time of Descartes. And I think probably before we talk about scientific method, and I'm not going to talk about the scientific method that much, at least not pertaining to this particular question of diagnosis. I'm going to talk about the scientific medicine as being a philosophical revolution before it was an experimental revolution, or maybe at the same time, or coincident with. And really, the main idea here is the rediscovery of ancient atomism. So with Descartes was among the first neo-atomists, if you will. He didn't use the term atomism, he used the term corpuscularism, but it's essentially the same thing. It's this idea about, it's a theory of matter, of what the physical world is constructed of. And at the time of Descartes, and he was one of the major proponents of it, but he was not the only one. There was a rediscovery and an embracing of the idea that had been proposed back 1700 years before by atomists in Greek atomists, mostly people like Democritus or Leucippus or Empedocles, ancient philosophers who had proposed that matter is organized in little parts and little atoms. And so there was a rediscovery at the end of the medieval period, during the Renaissance. Primarily, it was a rediscovery of ancient texts that had been lost. So in the Renaissance, there was a rediscovery of Epicurean texts and Stoic texts, but the Epicurean ones were the ones that were most influential. That had been lost for centuries. They were rediscovered, and the Epicureans were a school of philosophy that was very dominant in antiquity, in middle and late antiquity, in Roman times, and it started in ancient Greece, but it was adopted in Roman times. But it was, when people think about Epicureanism, they think mostly about their ethical stance and so forth. Same thing with the Stoics, but both the Stoics and the Epicureans were atomists. So they had adopted the theory of the ancient atomist of Democritus and his colleagues. And so they were atomists. And so when their texts were rediscovered in the Renaissance period and late medieval period, Western philosophers, were sort of, that caught their attention. Atomism caught their attention. And they ended up developing a mechanical worldview. And the reason it caught their attention is because by then there were lots of controversies in the West. I mean, there are always controversies, but there were controversies about the nature of matter and the nature of the world, the nature of the cosmos. And I think we're all familiar with the cosmological controversies about the planets and the heavenly bodies and how they move about. So there was, the beginning of the rejection of the Ptolemaic system, and we had Copernicus and whatnot, starting to challenge the ancient notions. So there were cosmological controversies, there were physical controversies. So the Aristotelian ideas about the motion of projectiles was found to be lacking and insufficient, and so people started questioning certain physical notions that had been taken for granted for many hundred years during the medieval period. There were controversies of a theological nature about the relationship between God and creation. You have the Protestant Reformation and so forth. And all of this sort of were fertile ground for trying to rethink the world in completely different ways. So when the philosophers discovered the Epicurean texts and discovered this idea about atomism, they sort of latched onto it, because atomism essentially would be helpful to develop a mechanical view of nature. Now, the ancient atomists were not strictly speaking mechanists. Atomism was proposed by Democritus back in his days to solve a philosophical riddle that was promoted by followers of Zeno and followers of what's his name? I'm blanking on the Parmenides. So these were sort of philosophical readers about the nature of matter and the nature of change. And I'm not going to get into this. I mean, it'd be interesting to develop to I think they're very interesting ideas. We'll develop them later on. But Democritus and the ancient atomists had this idea that matter is made of little things that are uncuttable, little atoms, little particles, in order to answer a certain philosophical problem that they were confronted with. When Descartes and the new atomists rediscovered this atomistic philosophy, they do it with the idea that it would help explain the world, if it would help to explain the world as a big machine, a big mechanic, perhaps designed by God, or right, or in certain way, but instead to view the world in mechanical terms, because they also had, with Galileo and the people of the time of preceding Descartes and around the time, there had been advances in mathematics as well, and including the advances that Descartes himself had made. So you could marry atomism with mathematics and then start to create a mechanistic theory, number one. And number two, technologically, there were machines were being invented in the Renaissance and whatnot. So it was sort of, just the commerce and the development of the machine in the Renaissance was also kind of a helpful sort of model to inspire philosophers to start to think about the world in mechanical terms. So you have this development of mechanical worldview in the Renaissance, late Renaissance, early modern period, and Descartes is really, the prime figure that would really make this very explicit. And so he really explicitly proposed a worldview that was entirely mechanical. So the whole physical world is mechanical, according to Descartes, and he was very explicit about that. It wasn't that he was using mechanism as a model for the world. He really thought that the world was essentially a giant mechanic. Okay, and he applied that idea of mechanicism to physiology, and notably, he thought that animals were really mechanical beings. So, according to Descartes, animals were automatons, that they had no intrinsic movement of their own, that they really were parts that were moving exactly. I mean, they were a machine, according to Descartes. And Descartes was explicit. He thought that our idea that when we see a dog go about in one way or another, or act at least ostensibly with some kind of spontaneous life motion, Descartes thought that was an illusion, that really all the animals were completely were machines and moving automatically according to laws of physics put in place by God. And so he imagined physiology as being completely mechanical, and so he pushed that idea about mechanical physiology to human bodies as well, not to human beings, but to human bodies. And it's from there that we get the Cartesian dualism, right, between the mind and the body, with the mind being sort of a spiritual being, according to Descartes, and the body being a mechanical being. Okay, so Descartes proposes this very dualistic idea um, of the human body being a machine and the human mind being a spiritual being that controls the machine the way, you know, the Wizard of Oz, if you will, controls his own mechanics. So that's the mechanical worldview of Descartes, and I think it's very important because um, it attracted the attention of a lot of people, and many other, you know, philosophers sort of latched on to this, or maybe developed it sort of simultaneously at the same time. So if we want to go and push this into the concept of health, then Descartes himself started to view health, a healthy body, as a well-made clock. That's you know, in his writings, and I think it's in the method on the discourse on the method. You know, he viewed the healthy body essentially as a well-made clock. So it's a very, very mechanical view of health, and therefore, by contrast, a diseased body is a broken clock. Okay, so you have the concept of a well-made clock on the one hand for the healthy body, and the diseased body being a broken clock. And from this, you start seeing what is termed iatro, you know, concepts or ideas about health and disease that were propagated under the label of iatrophysics and iatrochemistry, and in general iatromechanics. Okay, so meaning explanations about physiology and health and disease that would essentially be an application of the physical laws, the mechanical physical laws that were being discovered in the footsteps of Descartes and Francis Bacon and whatnot. We have Newton and the laws of motion and so forth. But with that, in the 17th century and 18th century, you have these ideas about iatrophysics, iatrochemistry, and iatromechanism, which in a way, I think, as far as I'm concerned, are really the origins of scientific medicine. Even though at the time there was no knowledge about cell biology, there was no knowledge about the germ theory of disease and so forth, but the concepts themselves preceded them, and they were there and they were present with Descartes and with his followers, and with the 17th and 18th century philosophers and philosophers/scientists. Okay, so in that framework of iatrophysics, iatrochemistry, iatromechanism, the diagnosis really is a description of a mechanical defect, right? Because if the healthy body is a well-made clock and the diseased body is a broken clock, then the process of diagnosis is primarily the process of describing what the mechanical defect is. All right. So from there, you have the scientific revolution, of course. You have Newton. I have a few figures here on this slide: Newton, Priestley, Claude Bernard, Charles Darwin, and so forth. All of them, even if it's not necessarily the focus of their science, all of them presume a mechanical world, right? A mechanical theory of matter and of the world, of the celestial bodies, of biology, and so forth. And they develop it, and they have success with it, and they push it further. And it then pervades not just the physical sciences, but it pervades also the social sciences. So Thomas Hobbes himself was a mechanicist. You know, he was the secretary to Francis Bacon. He was an atomist, and the people who followed him, John Locke, Hegel, Marx, all of them, at one level or another, had adopted or had taken for granted a mechanical worldview as a sort of a foundation for their philosophies. Okay, and that continues, and that in the 19th century, when you have the development of the microscope and the germ theory of disease and so forth, then health and mechanics become completely intertwined, and it becomes sort of a natural thing, even in psychology, right? So Freud in the 19th century had sort of mechanical, I mean, it's hard at that point to distinguish whether it was a metaphor or not, but when he thinks about the steam engine to talk about the suppressed or the repressed psychic drives in the mind, right? He's thinking about the machine, the prototype machine of his day, which is the steam engine. He thinks about the mind in mechanical terms, and that continues, you know, with you know, in the 20th century, of course. And then you have the Darwinian revolution. You have the idea of the DNA as a blueprint for the machine, Okay, even though it's as we will see, it's kind of a faulty analogy, but nevertheless, it sort of captures the imagination of people. The DNA is a blueprint, and now in current modern neuroscience, if you will, you have the computer as the prototypical machine, being sort of a model for the mind and the activity of the brain. Okay, so the mechanical proposal that was offered by Descartes in the late 1600s, right? Or late, sorry, yeah, in the early 1600s, is still alive and well. It's alive and well in everything, in how we think about the world, and it seems to have offered a boon for mankind in terms of the technological advances that it has allowed. But let's think about what it means really. I want to spend just a few moments to talk about what is a machine and how are we to think about this term mechanical. And a machine, if you take the dictionary definition, then a machine is, this is the dictionary.com, a machine by definition is an apparatus consisting of interrelated parts with separate functions used in the performance of some kind of work. So that's the basic definition of a machine. And I render it here. Essentially, a machine is parts with separate functions put together to do some work. Okay, and that is essentially what has captured the I think our medical ideas in large parts, and it's embedded in medical education. The way medical education, the way we experience it today, the machine concept in medical education was very much on the mind of Abraham Flexner. So I have Flexner here on the slide here to illustrate modern medical education. As we know, the Flexner reform that were started in the late, in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, although they were, the movement toward those reforms started in the 19th century, had embraced, first of all, they had embraced the German medical education paradigm, which was essentially put together at or imported into the Johns Hopkins Medical School curriculum. The Johns Hopkins Medical School curriculum was essentially a German medical school curriculum, and the German medical school in the 19th century had gone through a very, very drastic reform precisely to organize education along a mechanical understanding of the world and medicine. And how so? Well, one way that we can see it is that the way we all go through medical school and learn medicine, we start with building block sciences, right? We start with understanding physics first, and mathematics, and then chemistry, and then organic chemistry, and then biochemistry, and then microbiology and anatomy and all this. So you start with the building blocks, with the idea that if you know the parts, if you know the building blocks of the machine, eventually you will understand the whole. You'll understand the machine better, right? So there's also a great emphasis on laboratory work and analysis. I mean, that was clear in the Flexner report. If you read the Flexner report, it's all about medical school needing to have laboratories and train doctors in the laboratory sciences, right? And again, the underlying idea is that if you understand the parts, you can identify the defect, and then you can fix the whole. Okay, so it pervades that idea about the health and disease sort of is implicit in the Flexner report as a mechanical paradigm. Okay, I have one quote here from Flexner, from his report, where he actually talks about the machine. Here in this quote, I will read it. He says, "The student who has been successfully trained to regard the body as an infinitely complex machine learns to doubt his capacity to mend it summarily." So what he meant here, he was trying to say, we need to think about bodies as machines, and if we do, we'll realize how humble we need to be. So it was sort of an ethical admonition to be humble, but to be humble in front of the complexity of the machine that the body is. Okay. And again, here I'm not taking any position for or against that approach, but I'm just trying to trace it and state it. And of course, that idea about mechanism and mechanicism is uh, inhabits everything we do as doctors. I have on this slide a rough diagram of the metabolism of the angiotensin-renin system. And so what you have parts and arrows and little hormones pushing and acting on other parts in order to have an effect, right? So it's a very mechanical diagram. And this is how we understand physiology. We understand physiology, we understand pathophysiology, we understand all of this in mechanical and mechanistic terms, right? I mean, it'd be I think it'd be unthinkable right now to propose any kind of scientific research that doesn't have as part of its proposal some kind of mechanistic understanding of the ideas that it is pushing, right? I mean, so mechanicism is alive and very well, and for better or worse, it is what it is. Okay, so now having said all this, I want to go back and to summarize a little bit what the scientific mechanical diagnosis is. The view, in the scientific view, a disease is a mechanical defect in a well-made clock, right? So this idea that the body is a machine remains. The disease is a mechanical defect. The diagnosis is the process of identification of the defects, right? And the treatment is fixing the defect. And then health really is absence of disease. Okay, if the clock, if all the parts function properly and all the relationship between the parts are intact, then you have health, which is the absence of disease. You have the well-made clock. Okay. Lastly, I think this is reflected in the medical dictionary's definition of health, right? If you crack open a medical dictionary, you have something like this. This is from Stedman's. Health is the state of the organism when it is functioning optimally without evidence of disease or abnormality. Okay. So again, it's the idea of the well-made clock, meaning that it's the absence of defect that signifies health. Okay, and that's is taken to a greater extreme with the WHO definition. The WHO definition, you may be familiar with it, is the state of complete physical, mental, or social well-being, not just the absence of disease. So the WHO accepts this idea of health as the absence of disease, but it adds on to it a mental and social dimension. Okay, so I want to continue here, but I want to pause, give you a chance to see if you have any questions, or do I keep going?
So my entry into this entire area of philosophy has been through Jacques Ellul's Technological Society and that critique of modern society as a society oriented around technology, and the implications that has for all aspects of sociology, but notably for morality at some point.
Right.
And so the thing that strikes me from Stedman's medical dictionary is that definition is not that just that it is functioning, but notably that it is functionally optimally, which is a very technological way of thinking about reality, insofar as not only is there an operation that is to be achieved, but there is a point of technology. The idea behind technology is that it's constantly destroying itself. It's self-cannibalizing, because as soon as some new technique is invented, it has to be adopted simply because it is more efficient and it is more optimal in achieving the goals that the machine is designed for. Mm-hmm. So the danger, it seems to me, of inserting this language is, if we imply that the man is a machine, it puts in questions of what that optimal function is. And in principle, even a healthy person may be deemed unhealthy, as I see it by this definition, if a more efficient method of achieving the goals of that machine are discovered. If you follow.
Yeah, no, definitely. Right.
So it's really dangerous, because I don't know how true this, but I know René Guénon, he wrote about Critique of Modern Society, and in his critique he talks about how the ancients didn't really didn't really think of optimality as something that was valuable. Insofar as they knew about technology and they knew about technique, but it wasn't something that they oriented their society around.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
The term optimal is kind of loaded, so I'm glad that you sort of focused on this, because you're right that sort of technologically speaking, optimal, you imagine some kind of a curve where it has either a maximum or a minimum, and on either side of it, it's not optimal, and so you have to be very precisely in one spot. And it also and then it's optimal according to what? I mean, if you have machines, then you have to have a designer of the machine, and so you have to know what the machine is made for. This is a point that I will come to maybe a little bit later. So you're right. We but at the same time, optimal uh, has to contain the notion of what's good, and again, so what's good for who? Was good for
exactly.
who and for
Well, it
what and
certainly
so
should,
forth.
and it
Right.
can, but the
Right.
danger is, I guess, what happens when a society becomes increasingly technological?
Right.
Does it continue to understand that the notion of the good is implicit if it no longer understands that the notion of the good is something that is important to remember, if it
Right.
forgets about the idea?
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll get into that. I think some more. I think at the end of this talk on the this part one, if you will, on the scientific thing, uh, I think I'll have a few more slides just in a little bit that will allow us to elaborate more on this.
Great.
But if you don't mind, I'll just keep going here.
Sure.
And get a little bit more practical into, I mean, what does it mean in terms of modern medical practice, this mechanistic idea, if you will. And so here I have a slide where you have a woman who goes to the doctor, and she might ask him, doctor, for the last 3 days, I've had a fever and a cough, and I'm short of breath, and I lost my sense of smell. And a common expectation would be that the doctor would reply, okay, well, let me examine you and run some tests and see what's going on. Okay. I mean, that's a very standard, typical, and as far as I'm concerned, actually, it's a fine approach, with some caveats that we'll get into in a little bit. But if we take this approach as being very common and very sort of prototypical of what goes on between a patient and a doctor, it's not very different than if the same a similar conversation, sort of an analogous conversation would be if the woman went to the mechanic and said, my car is making strange clonking noises and doesn't accelerate when it's cold. And then the mechanic would say, okay, well, let me take a look under the hood, run some tests and see what's going on. Right? It's perfectly analogous. These two conversations are, as far as I'm concerned, perfectly analogous, of viewing the body as a machine, and therefore as having a defect that needs to be identified before it can be fixed. Right. So that leads to this modern scientific mechanical notion of diagnostic decision analysis. Right. If the disease is a mechanical defect, and if diagnosis implies identifying the defect, then the diagnostic process is a detection process, right? It's a process of looking in the body to see where the fault is, where the part that's not working is what is not working, or what is the relationship between the parts that is not right. But it's essentially a detection process, the same way as Sherlock Holmes would have it, right? I mean, in fact, it's not a coincidence that we have a Sherlock Holmes who was a character designed by a 19th century retired physician, and there's as a sidekick he has a Watson, right? The detection process is the modern view of what the diagnostic process is, right? And from there you get modern diagnostic decision analysis. And I think you may be familiar with these 2x2 tables, where you run a test, right? You have a patient with a complaint, right? The patient is not well. You run a test, And then you decide, is this a true positive for whatever disease you anticipate the patient may have, or is it a false positive or a true negative, or this 2 by 2 table. Well, what's interesting is that this decision analysis is actually was imported into medicine from signal detection, from radar signal detection in the middle of the 20th century, right? It's not native to medicine. It's and itself, even there in signal detection, it was also imported, I think, from although in a modified way or in a distinct way from industrial processes where they had to have certain procedures to apply to the assembly line and reject samples that were good or not good, or find samples that would show that the construction process was defective. So all of these kind of mechanical principles that were developed in other areas, in technological heavy areas, industrial processes or signal detection, radar detection, blah, 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 get imported into medicine in the 20th century. And so the 2 by 2 table of diagnostic decision analysis is an adoption from there. Now, the problem here is that, and I think it goes to your point. The problem is that all these decision analysis tables require the idea of a gold standard, right? There has to be a gold standard to tell us if the test is a true positive or a false positive. Okay. It has to be. There has to be one ultimate arbiter of the decision process. And the problem, of course, is that there's no such a thing as a gold standard, whether we talk about health or disease, right? I mean, it's not as if we had a gold standard of a human being. On this slide, I have the Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci, right? That famous picture of the man with his arms extended, in a circle, right? Whereas Da Vinci in the Renaissance, again, sort of the beginning of this attraction to mechanical ideas. So Da Vinci had imagined man as a perfect man, and he had, perfectly proportioned, right? So Vitruvian was an ancient an architect of Roman times, and I think his writings were again rediscovered in the Renaissance. And so, following that model, Da Vinci had proposed for the human bodies to be proportioned, according to certain perfect proportions. I have a quote here from Da Vinci. The human body is so designed by nature that the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair is a 10th part of the whole height. The open hand from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger is just the same. The head from the chin to the crown is an 1/8, and with the neck and shoulder from the top of the breast to the lowest roots of the hair is a 6th, etc. Right? So we'll come back to this idea because I think it's important and it's not entirely wrong, but there's no way that human beings are proportioned in such an exact manner, and there's really no gold standard of a healthy, well-made clock the way Descartes would have it, right? So that problem of signal analysis and detection and gold standard is real, and it's the same for a disease. So if you have a patient, there's no prototype of a COVID-19 patient to serve as a gold standard, right? So we cannot, when we have a patient that we think may have COVID-19, we cannot make a comparison between what that patient has and a gold standard COVID-19 patient, right? Such a patient does not exist. Okay. So now if we go back to our 4 scenarios of James, the 72-year-old, we see that this mechanical theory about what disease and health is, we can see that it runs into a problem here, right? Because whether we look at the person with a stroke who's positive for SARS-CoV-2, or even the patient who has shortness of breath and low oxygen and a positive test for SARS-CoV-2, or the person in the in the nursing home who happens to be, all these scenarios, none of them can be, we cannot answer, does the patient have SARS-CoV-2 on the basis of having a gold standard or some kind of a mechanical prototype to which, according to which then we can say, yes, COVID-19 is the diagnosis, right? So that's the problem. And what doesn't add up is what we're going to talk here for the last few minutes before we close this particular chapter, is that organisms are not machines, right? So this idea that Descartes had that was so attractive, for scientists for so long, is not correct. It's false. I stole the title for the slide from a paper, and I can put it on the show notes. It's a paper by, I think, a very, very good contemporary philosopher of nature and of science, Daniel Nicholson. I've read a lot of his things about precisely the history of this idea about organisms and machines, and how organisms are really not machines and they cannot be considered as machines. And my final slide here, or final couple of slides, is to show why organisms are not machines. Number one here is machines are built, right? Whereas organisms develop. I mean, it's a crucial distinction, right? In a machine, the parts pre-exist. You put the parts together and you get your machine. In an organism, we know that organisms develop, right? There's 1 cell, 2 cells, 3 cells, but it starts from within. There's a process of development. Machines have a blueprint, and organisms do not have a blueprint. As we said, the DNA is not a blueprint. It's in fact, I mean, many people realize that. There's not long ago, I can't remember who wrote it. Kind of a famous person wrote something about DNA not being a blueprint. If I find it, I'll put it on the show notes. But it's the DNA cannot be a blueprint because the DNA is part of the body, right? You cannot have the blueprint be part of the house or the car or the construction, right? So, I mean, it has features that are analogous, but it's not. It's a false. It's not a precise analogy. At least it cannot be.
It's not
determined.
Immune to deviation.
Correct. A machine is built for an extrinsic purpose, right? You make the clock in order to tell time, right? And it's built for the good of the builder or the good of the owner of the machine, whereas an organism has an intrinsic purpose, right? Whether it's a dog or an amoeba or a human being, or right, there's sort of an intrinsic life of the organism, right? And machines being an assembly of parts, and the parts in a machine, the parts are really fundamental. They're assembled, and then you get the machine. The machine has no self, right? There's no self to a machine. The self is kind of an extrinsic attribution, whereas an organism has a self, and it's self-directing, self-growing, and most importantly, self-healing. Very, very much self-healing. Although that healing process can fail, obviously, and that's why we have medicine and doctors. So in a machine, the parts are fundamental and the whole is accidental. Whereas in an organism, there's always a mutual benefit of part and whole. That I think that maybe, I mean, there are many, you can draw that table of comparison between machines and organisms, but that to me is a kind of a fundamental distinction between the machine and the organism, right? In the organism, there's a mutual benefit of the part and the whole, right? My kidney works for my own good, right? But also I work to help my kidney and my liver, and likewise my brain and my heart and everything else, right? And so there's sort of a symbiosis, if you will, or however you want to call it, between all the parts of the organism. Whereas in the machine, the parts couldn't care less. I mean, they are what they are. They don't know about the whole, right? You can make a machine that mimics what an organism is by having feedback loops and whatnot. But ultimately, at some point, there's always a point there where it stops, where you have to have the extrinsic determinant of purpose and healing and so forth. So that's that. And I think maybe we'll stop here for this part. And then the next time we'll talk about the alternative, which is the how the Hippocratic tradition continues to inform our medical practice. I think it's even though we don't pay attention to it or we ignore it, at the same time we cannot not be inspired by it. So we'll talk about that next time, if that's okay with you. Any final thoughts here, Roman?
It seems that the Hippocratic part of medicine sort of has took a sideline.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's in the curriculum or really just in general in terms of the total mental effort that's being expended on it. It's almost the way that the system would like us to think is that there was this sudden gap. Basically, the ancient Greeks had their philosophy and then it ended. And then ever since, there's been no continuation of that tradition, even though we know that's not exactly true. But it would be hard pressed to. I'm sure many people would be able to name Locke and Descartes, but very few would be able to sort of name somebody associated with this let's call it traditionalist view of
Mm-hmm.
organic self
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
beyond the ancient Greeks.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yet I think it continues, and I think it
Exactly
has
in the
been
shadows.
right in the shadows because it has truth in it, and it's hard to you can't really get rid of truth like that. If it has some very good and truthful elements in it, it will persist. But you're right that first of all, it's been caricatured as being primarily now a value on the ethical side of things, and not so much on the fundamental scientific side of things. And I think that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think next time I'll show why that's wrong. But it's been so now there's kind of a nice piety about the Hippocratic Oath and why it's good to treat each other in an ethical way. But bioethicists, by and large, have rejected the Hippocratic Oath, or many of them are actively trying to abolish it and sabotage it. And number two, I think it's wrong to think of it only purely as because the ethics, the Hippocratic ethics didn't come out of nowhere. They are based on a certain understanding of what reality is, and so and that fundamental reality is present in Hippocratic medicine in ways that are relevant today, and so. But I'll leave that for next time. I don't want to get into into this for too long. We've talked for a good while now. So
I guess one last comment on the mechanical point of view is Ortega y Gasset, in his critique of modern, let's call it scientism.
Right.
He has a point where he talks about how the promise of the scientific philosophy is that as we get more and more in-depth knowledge of each subsystem, of each submachine, as we call it, each part, that we would become enlightened, that we would reach a better understanding of the whole. But Ortega y Gasset points out that, in fact, what happens is the opposite, because the machine is, in fact, so complicated and so complex that to get a better understanding of each part, you have to become increasingly a specialist. And so you become increasingly myopic to the rest of the organism. So even finally, when you are capable of solving this defect in the subpart, you are no longer capable of solving the whole system.
That's an excellent point, and I forgot to mention it because I think it's a very natural development of this mechanical understanding of health and disease and medicine that there would be so many specialists, right? And so we are subspecialized. We lament our increasing specialization. I mean, we lament it in a certain way. I mean, doctors are doing fine, and specialists are doing very well materially, precisely because the system in general has accepted this mechanical view and has accepted the hyperspecialization of things and rewards it, and so forth. But yeah, you're right. So, but I think, I mean, beyond what Ortega and Gasset was saying, it's not so much the complexity of the machine that is such that we need to maybe step back away from it to understand it better. I mean, I think that's true, but I think more deeply, I think it's not, we are not machines. I mean, I
Right.
think it's a false metaphor. I mean, it's a metaphor that has maybe some utility, and maybe in part 3 of our conversations, maybe after, if next time I go into the Hippocratic tradition, the time after that, perhaps we can see how the two should fit together. What's a good way to make them fit together? But
Great.
if it's a metaphor, it should be considered as such, as a metaphor, and we need to keep in mind what the reality is, right? But right now we're unsure. We take it as a metaphor, but maybe it's the reality. We don't know for sure, and because it produces such technological wonders, it's very tempting to confuse the metaphor and reality, and to view the two as if they were the same. Great, Roman. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I
I
look
think
forward to it.
we'll stop here, and then we'll catch up next time with part 2. And